In the winter of 1299, cold winds swept down from the Hindu Kush and carried with them a fear that settled across northern India. A Mongol army under the veteran commander Kutlug Khwaja had crossed the frontier and was riding straight toward the beating heart of the Delhi Sultanate. These were not ordinary raiders. They belonged to the same war machine that had crushed Persia, devastated Transoxiana, and shattered kingdoms from Anatolia to China. Now they were descending upon one of the richest cities in Asia. Many in Delhi believed no force could stop them. Even the Sultan's closest advisors urged him to retreat behind the capital's massive walls and pray that the storm would pass, as it had in other lands that had fallen before Mongol fury. But Sultan Alauddin Khalji was not a man who bent before danger. He possessed something no other ruler of the region had ever attempted, a weapon not of steel or muscle, but of organization, discipline, and the unseen power of administration. And when the Mongols finally met him on the open fields of Kili, just miles from Delhi, they would learn that their legendary invincibility could be broken. People today remember the iconic images of medieval Indian warfare, the thunder of war elephants, the fluttering banners, the clash of lancers and horsemen. Yet Delhi's true secret weapon at Kili was not on the battlefield at all. It lived in the system Alauddin Khalji had built, an intricate structure of supply, regulation, planning, and control that turned his army into something the Mongols had never truly faced in India. To understand how a state that had once feared the Mongols managed to beat them, we must turn back to the early encounters between the two powers, long before Kili, before even the Khalji dynasty. Back to a time when the interaction between Delhi and the Mongols began almost by accident. In the 1220s, when Genghis Khan chased a Khwarezmian prince across Central Asia, his pursuit carried Mongol forces southward toward the Indian frontier. That was the first moment the two worlds brushed against one another. Nothing came of it then. Delhi was far from the Mongols' main priorities, and the Great Khan was more focused on conquering China and Persia. For decades, India remained on the periphery of Mongol attention, but as the century drew to a close, the geopolitical map of the Mongol Empire fractured. The empire split into 4 Khanates, and the Chagatai Khanate, wedged between powerful rivals to the east, west, and south, found itself pushed toward only one viable direction, into the Indian subcontinent. That was when real danger arrived. Even before the Khaljis came to power, Sultan Balban understood the threat long before it reached Delhi. He knew waiting for the Mongols to cross the frontier would be a fatal mistake. So he created a massive frontier defense line along the Beas River, a chain of heavily manned fortresses, garrisons, and watchtowers designed to halt nomadic armies. It was one of the earliest attempts in India to build a hardened defensive buffer against steppe warfare. In 1285, the Mongols tested this barrier at the Battle of the Beas River. The Delhi forces managed to repel them, but the price was devastating. Balban's own son, Prince Muhammad, was killed. His death was not simply a personal tragedy. It was a warning, a grim reminder that resisting the Mongols would always demand sacrifice. When the Khalji dynasty rose, the Mongol threat did not fade. Sultan Jalaluddin Khalji faced another incursion in 1292 and defeated it, yet the raids continued. By 1296 and 1297, the attacks increased in frequency and intensity. Something was changing in Mongol intentions. They were no longer satisfied with border raids. They were probing deeper, perhaps preparing for something larger. That something arrived in 1299. Kutlug Khwaja, a seasoned commander who had survived the brutal wars of Central Asia, marched directly toward Delhi with a massive army. This was no fleeting raid. It was an invasion aimed at conquering the capital itself. His tactics proved it. He bypassed smaller towns and forts, ignoring everything except his main goal. It was the Mongol way: strike fast, strike hard, and crush the enemy's will before they fully grasp what is happening. But there was one factor he had not calculated. Years of Mongol warfare in the heart of Asia had pushed waves of refugees southward. Families, artisans, craftsmen, and most importantly, battle-hardened cavalry and archers fled into the safety of the Delhi Sultanate, one of the most stable Muslim centers in the region. Among them were men who had fought the Mongols directly and survived. These soldiers, skilled in mounted archery, evasive tactics, and steppe warfare, brought with them invaluable experience. Suddenly, Delhi's military was no longer a purely regional force. It became a force capable of meeting the Mongols on equal terms, rider against rider, bow against bow. When Alauddin Khalji ascended the throne, he inherited not only a kingdom, but an army shaped by decades of conflict, supplemented by immigrants who understood the Mongol way of war. That was his hidden advantage, and he refined it into something unprecedented on the subcontinent. But to maintain such a large and professional force required a fortune. Salaries, rations, horses, weapons, armor, every part of it devoured the treasury. Alauddin knew this, so he did something radical. He restructured the entire state into a machine designed to sustain war. Before him, sultans relied heavily on provincial nobles, landholders who collected taxes and supplied their own troops. These nobles served the sultan in name, but in practice they acted like miniature kings. Their loyalty was inconsistent, and in times of crisis they might hesitate, disobey, or even rebel. Alauddin refused to let the fate of the empire rest in their hands. He stripped these nobles of military autonomy and created instead a massive standing army that answered only to him. He paid them not with land, but in cash, direct wages from the central government. It seems ordinary now, but in the 13th century it was revolutionary. No longer would the defense of Delhi depend on feuding aristocrats. Power returned to the throne. Yet this solution brought a new challenge: corruption. Officers could lie about the number of troops they commanded. They could bring weak or untrained horses while claiming pay for elite ones. To solve this, Alauddin introduced two groundbreaking systems: Dog, which branded every horse in the army with an official mark to ensure its quality, and Chera, a detailed physical record of every soldier, noting features, height, build, scars, and complexion. These measures prevented fraudulent recruitment and guaranteed that every man listed was real, properly equipped, and accountable. With this, Alauddin transformed his army from a loose feudal host into a precise, trustworthy military structure. Maintaining such a force, however, required money, constant, reliable money. Alauddin responded with a sweeping set of market regulations that controlled nearly every essential good. Grain, vegetables, meat, cloth, horses, everything had fixed maximum prices. He lowered soldiers' salaries but ensured that the cost of living was so stable and low that even modest pay was enough for comfort. The state created enormous grain reserves and punished merchants who hoarded or inflated prices. What emerged was something like an early state-managed supply chain. While the Mongols depended on rapid movement and foraging, Alauddin ensured Delhi's forces never lacked food or equipment. These intertwined systems, military, economic, administrative, formed the true secret weapon of Delhi, and all of it would be put to the ultimate test at Kili. When Kutlug Khwaja crossed the frontier in 1299, Alauddin refused to hide in the capital. He marched out with 70,000 soldiers, and 700 armored war elephants. The Mongols likely numbered between 50 and 60,000, a smaller force but far more experienced. They expected Delhi to crumble. Instead, they found themselves facing 5 tightly coordinated divisions, backed by towering elephants and protected by terrain that nullified their favorite maneuvers. One flank was shielded by forest, the other by the Yamuna River. The Mongol cavalry, famous for their sweeping encirclements, suddenly had no room to maneuver. What followed would shake the myth of Mongol invincibility in India. The battlefield of Kili transformed quickly into a contest not only of strength, but of discipline. Both armies relied heavily on cavalry, yet the way they wielded their horsemen could not have been more different. Alauddin's forces were not a simple mass of riders charging blindly into combat. They were an integrated machine of mounted archers who loosed volleys at range and armored lancers who excelled in brutal close-quarters combat. Delhi's lancers in particular possessed heavier armor and longer spears than their Mongol counterparts, giving them an edge once the two sides collided. But the Mongols had mastered something else entirely: the art of deception. At Kili, they attempted one of their oldest tricks, a maneuver that had crushed armies across the world: the feigned retreat. To a disciplined commander, it was a deadly test. To an impulsive one, it was a death sentence. And among Delhi's ranks stood Zafar Khan, a man of immense courage, perhaps too much for his own good. When the Mongol general Hejlak began pulling his troops back in what appeared to be panic, Zafar Khan saw an opportunity to strike the decisive blow. Without waiting for Alauddin's signal, without even consulting the chain of command, he gave the order to pursue. His men thundered forward across 18 kios, nearly 35 kilometers, chasing an enemy that seemed to fold before them. Then the trap slammed shut. The retreating Mongols wheeled around in perfect coordination, tightening a noose around Zafar Khan from multiple directions. Surrounded and outnumbered, he and his men fought with astonishing ferocity and inflicted heavy casualties, but there was no escape from the encirclement. By the time dust settled, Zafar Khan and nearly all his troops had been wiped out. One might expect the Sultan to mourn him as a hero fallen in battle, but Alauddin did not publicly glorify him. Instead, he condemned the disobedience. His entire military system, its discipline, its structure, its reliability, depended on absolute adherence to command. Zafar Khan's impulsive pursuit, however brave, had endangered the entire left flank of the army and could have doomed the battle. In Alauddin's eyes, personal valor meant nothing if it threatened the stability of the whole. This reaction revealed the true heart of his war machine. It did not rely on heroic individuals. It relied on cohesion. Yet even with the loss of one of his finest generals, Alauddin did not panic. His lines held. His center did not buckle. His reserves remained exactly where he had placed them. Command remained intact. When Kutlug Khwaja saw that Zafar Khan had been eliminated, he believed Delhi's formation would surely collapse. He struck the center with overwhelming force, trying to split the army in two before it could recover. But his timing faltered. His flanks could not advance quickly enough to support the assault, and the Mongol wings lagged behind. This moment of imbalance was all Alauddin needed. From behind the left flank, Ulugh Khan, commander of the reserves and a man perfectly positioned for such an opening, swept in. His cavalry crashed into the exposed Mongol center from the side, turning the momentum of battle in an instant. For days the struggle raged. Dust and screams filled the fields. Horses collapsed in exhaustion. Arrows darkened the sky. But slowly, inevitably, Delhi's numerical advantage, Its mixed arms strategy and its carefully coordinated formations ground down the Mongol assault. Then came the turning point. Kutlug Khwaja was gravely wounded. Some accounts claim he died soon after the battle. With their commander gone and their supply situation deteriorating, the Mongols began to withdraw. Kili was not the final Mongol invasion India would face, but it shattered something far more important than a single army. It broke the aura of Mongol invincibility. Across Asia, the Mongols had conquered empires by smashing their armies in the open field. At Kili, the Delhi Sultanate stood firm and fought them on equal terms, not through luck, not through overwhelming numbers, but through careful planning, discipline, and a military system unlike anything the subcontinent had seen before. But history never grants long periods of rest. Only 4 years later, in October of 1303, another Mongol force under Taragai crossed into India. This time, Delhi was unprepared in the worst possible moment. The main imperial armies were scattered. One force was limping back from the costly siege of Chittor, while another marched south toward Warangal in the Deccan. The capital stood nearly defenseless. When Alauddin galloped back to Delhi, he found his situation grim beyond imagination. Monsoon rains had damaged weapons and armor, horses were exhausted, and supplies were dangerously low. The empire that had stood tall at Kili now faced an enemy at its doorstep, with barely an army to defend it. Taragai wasted no time. His forces pushed deep, establishing camps only 10 kilometers, barely a morning's ride, from Delhi itself. Panic rippled through the city. Prices surged. Citizens fled the outskirts. Rumors spread like wildfire that the Mongols would breach the capital at any moment. And for once, Alauddin Khalji could not meet the invaders in open battle. So he made a choice that would test the very core of the system he had built. He withdrew into the incomplete fort of Siri. Siri was not yet a finished fortress, but its location made it ideal for a desperate stand. Protected on 3 sides by the Yamuna River, dense forest, and the old city of Delhi, it offered natural defenses, except to the north, where the land lay wide open. Alauddin solved this by ordering his soldiers to dig a deep moat and reinforce it with a makeshift wooden barricade, ripping beams, doors, and timber from Delhi's homes to build it. Behind this improvised wall, he positioned rows of infantry and archers, and in front of them, he placed 5 armored war elephants like colossal living shields. The Mongols, accustomed to swift cavalry maneuvers and open plains, suddenly found themselves facing a fortress built from desperation but fortified by genius. For more than 2 months, they surrounded Delhi. They plundered villages, burned fields, and tried relentlessly to provoke Alauddin into leaving the fortress. But he refused to be lured out. The Mongols, formidable in open battle, were poor siege warriors. They lacked engines, rams, and the engineering support required for a prolonged assault. And worse for them, the countryside around Delhi had been systematically stripped of supplies by Alauddin's earlier policies. Grain was stored in state granaries. Fodder had been harvested or secured. Villages had been evacuated. There was nothing for the Mongols to live off. The world's most mobile army found itself trapped in a slow, grinding starvation. Horses weakened. Soldiers fell ill. The longer they stayed, the worse their situation became. After 2 months, they had no choice. Taragai's forces retreated, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could not outlast Alauddin's system, a system designed not just to fight wars, but to shape the battlefield long before swords were drawn. When the siege ended, Delhi was shaken, nearly broken, but alive. Alauddin took the lesson to heart. Improvised defenses had saved him once, but he vowed never to face such vulnerability again. The fort of Siri was completed and expanded into a permanent citadel. A dedicated frontier army was established, a standing force whose sole duty was to guard the northwest border. A new governor was appointed to oversee these defenses, ensuring that future invasions would be intercepted far from the capital. Never again would the Mongols come so close to conquering northern India. The Mongol retreat after the siege of 1303 left Delhi in a strange silence. The city had survived, but the cost of endurance hung in the air like a scar. Broken houses, stripped timbers, makeshift barricades, and the memories of nights filled with terror reminded everyone how close the empire had come to collapse. Merchants returned to their shops, farmers trickled in from nearby villages, and soldiers emerged from the half-built walls of Siri, exhausted but hardened. Alauddin looked upon the capital not with relief, but with a renewed understanding of the enemy he faced. The Mongols were relentless, unpredictable, and capable of exploiting even the smallest lapse in preparedness. If Delhi intended to thrive, it could not afford another moment of vulnerability. He immediately began strengthening the empire's defensive structure. The fort at Siri, once a desperate shelter built under the shadow of imminent destruction, was transformed into a formidable military complex. Walls were rebuilt in stone, gates fortified, and barracks expanded to house large, permanent contingents. The moat that once saved Delhi through improvisation became a planned component of the city's defenses. Across the empire, more watchtowers were erected, supply lines reorganized, and communication routes tightened. Alauddin had seen how quickly the Mongols could move. Now he wanted alarms to spread across provinces at the first sign of hooves approaching the frontier. But defense alone was not enough. Alauddin understood that the key to surviving the Mongols lay not only in walls or soldiers, but in readiness, an ever-present vigilance. So he created a dedicated northern frontier army, a full-time force whose sole duty was to guard the empire's most vulnerable boundary. These troops were positioned not in Delhi, but far forward, close to the passes and plains where Mongol riders first appeared. Their commanders were chosen for discipline rather than aristocratic lineage. Their salaries were regular, their horses branded under the dog system, and their numbers checked meticulously under the Chera registry. They were, in many ways, the purest embodiment of Alauddin's military reforms, professional, accountable, and permanently mobilized. This transformation had broader consequences. For decades, Mongol raids had kept northern India in a state of fear. Farmers abandoned fields near the frontier. Merchants avoided important trade routes. Cities lived in quiet anxiety, unsure when the next wave of riders would sweep down from the mountains. But as the new system took root, this fear began to subside. The Mongols had been pushed away from the capital not by a single battle, but by an entire network of defenses that made repeated invasions increasingly difficult. Delhi, for the first time in years, could breathe. The psychological shift was profound. Across the subcontinent, stories of Mongol invincibility had circulated for generations. Tales of entire cities burned, kingdoms erased, armies annihilated by the thunder of hooves had intimidated even the boldest rulers. Yet here in India, a different narrative was emerging. The Mongols could be stopped. Their arrows were not unstoppable. Their cavalry was not untouchable. Their commanders were not immortal. The victory at Kili had cracked the myth. The survival of Delhi in 1303 shattered it. In court chronicles and oral traditions, Alauddin's name began to carry a weight unmatched by his predecessors. He was not just a sultan, He was the man who had beaten the greatest warriors on earth. Scholars, poets, and travelers wrote of how his strategies had preserved the heart of India. Merchants regained confidence and reopened trade links stretching to Gujarat, Bengal, and the Deccan. Families returned to villages once abandoned out of fear. And on the frontier, the new army stood firm, a living reminder that the empire was no longer on the defensive. It was asserting its permanence. But this newfound stability did not make Alauddin complacent. If anything, it hardened his resolve. He refined the market control system further, setting even stricter regulations on prices and storage. Granaries multiplied across the Sultanate, stacked high with grain ready for both military campaigns and emergency distribution. Inspectors traveled between marketplaces, ensuring fairness and vigilance. The administration, once loosely organized, now functioned with a precision that astonished even contemporary chroniclers. Every soldier's pay, every merchant's inventory, every shipment of fodder and grain became part of a meticulously monitored network. And beneath all of this, Alauddin continued strengthening the cavalry, the heart of his military power. Horses were imported from regions famed for their breeding, and the branding system ensured their quality remained unmatched. Soldiers trained relentlessly in archery, formation maneuvers, and coordinated charges. Delhi's cavalry, once inferior to the Mongols, now rivaled them. The empire's armies could march farther, move faster, and fight with more consistency than any force India had fielded before. Word of these transformations spread beyond the borders of Delhi. Neighboring rulers began to watch the Sultanate with a mixture of respect and apprehension. Some sought alliances, hoping to stand under the protection of the one state that had endured the Mongol storm. Others feared Delhi's rising authority, sensing that Alauddin's ambitions were no longer confined to survival. The Sultanate was becoming an empire in its own right, wealthy, disciplined, and militarily formidable. Yet even as Alauddin expanded his influence across the subcontinent, launching campaigns into Gujarat, suppressing rebellions, and asserting dominance over rival kingdoms, he never lost sight of the Mongols. Reports from the frontier were read with utmost seriousness. Patrols increased. Fortresses along the Bias and Indus rivers were reinforced. The memory of 1303 lingered like a shadow behind every decision. The empire must never again stand unprepared. And for a time, the Mongols continued probing. Small raiding parties tested the frontier, hoping to find weaknesses. Some were repelled by the new border army. Others never made it past the mountain passes, halted by scouts and cavalry patrols. But none reached Delhi again. The Mongols, once poised to take the richest city in northern India, now found themselves confronted by a state that had learned their methods and adapted with astonishing speed. As years passed, the ripples of Alauddin's reforms continued shaping the subcontinent. The concept of a permanent, centrally controlled army took root, influencing future rulers. The system of market regulations, granaries, and supply management laid the foundations for economic stability that would outlast his reign. The devastating panic that had once accompanied every rumor of a Mongol advance gradually faded. Merchants traveled more freely. Farmers settled lands previously considered too dangerous. Urban centers flourished. Delhi entered a golden period of prosperity and architectural growth. New mosques, palaces, gardens, and marketplaces sprang up, funded by the wealth of a stabilized economy and expanding empire. Scholars arrived from Persia and Central Asia, drawn to the court of a ruler who had resisted the Mongols not by fleeing, but by building an administrative fortress that proved more formidable than any wall. Yet among all the achievements of Alauddin Khalji's reign, None stood as prominently as his defiance of the Mongols. This defiance was not the result of reckless bravery or a single victorious charge. It was built through years of planning, reform, vigilance, and an understanding that war in the 13th and 14th centuries was not won solely by warriors, but by systems. Alauddin transformed Delhi from a vulnerable capital into the center of a resilient empire capable of standing against the greatest conquerors of its age.